Good evening again. Thank you so much. Hopefully you make some new friends tonight. Um, so we do have one more seat. If you have to come all the way to the front and kind of walk around, but there's one over on this far wall. And then once everyone's settled, we might be able to sneak a couple more chairs in. But thank you so much. It's a very exciting evening for us, and we're so happy that you could join us. You may have noticed when you sat down that there was a little piece of paper on your seat. That is a survey, and it should take you 2 or 3 minutes to fill out at the end of the program. We greatly appreciate the information. It helps us so much to know what we should be doing down the line and how we should be preparing our programs. And we do have extra clipboards and pencils at the reception table. So when you're done, we'll be collecting them there. And at the end, if you do need a pencil, we can give it to you. We also have quite a few exciting programs coming down the line. A new exhibition will be opening on March 30th. This is our Close to the Wind Maritime History. And it's looking at how actually being a town on the coast has shaped our history and how we've used the waters from an industrial standpoint to a more leisurely yachting pastime. We have a couple of programs that will be accompanying that exhibition. The first one is actually April 1st, and that is our storytelling event. It's called Story Barn, and the theme is Any Port in a Storm. So if anyone just then thought of a story, you should come and see me and present at this event. It's really fun, and even if you don't have a story, you should join us. It's a very enjoyable evening. And then on April 19th, we'll be hosting John Rumanier. He is an accomplished sailor, writer, and historian, and he will be looking at how yachting has developed in Long Island Sound and the history of racing as well. And then on March 3rd, we will host a book talk by Richard. This is March 3rd. May 3rd. May 3rd. As soon as this is done, do not move. No, May 3rd. So on May 3rd, we will have another book talk that will be presented by 2 authors, Richard Brown and Paul Cohen, and they'll be looking at the coastal maps that were used by the British and the French navies during the American Revolution. And a lot of these really haven't been seen before because they were made on the boats. So these are sort of new maps that are coming to light and being researched. And then much further down the road in August, we will be doing a harbor tour on the Island Beach Ferry, and we'll just be doing a historical cruise of the harbor in the evening. So hopefully I will see all of you at all of these events. There's a lot going on. But before we get started, I would like to personally thank our corporate sponsors, Wells Fargo Advisors and Wealth and Investment Management, Sally Reagan, Financial Advisor, and Marie Williams, Vice President. Their support has been instrumental in making all of this happen, so thank you very much. And then I would also like to recognize David Wierdsma, in whose memory we host this lecture. He was a great supporter of the Greenwich Historical Society as well as the arts, and it's really a pleasure to be able to remember him and honor him in this way. So at this point, I'd like to hand the podium over to our Executive Director, Dr. Deborah Mecki, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Anna. And for those of you who don't know Anna Greco is our Curator of Education and a wonderful part of our staff here. Well, I also want to welcome you to this distinguished lecture on landscape, which is made possible, as Anna mentioned, by the David R. Wierdsma Fund and our generous corporate sponsor, Wells Fargo Advisors, Wealth and Investment. David Wierdsma was a great friend of the Greenwich Historical Society. His legacy includes the formation of French Farm, the Friends of French Farm, who preserved the historic farm buildings and the artful landscape that he created on Lake Avenue in Greenwich. In also establishing an endowment fund at the Historical Society for programs, he observed that Bush Holly Historic Site and French Farm share a commitment to offering our community the opportunity to bridge the past, present, and future through the enjoyment and understanding of our unique cultural landscapes. His vision and generosity will continue to touch the lives of innumerable people for generations to come. Our lecturer, Dr. Elizabeth Mankin Kornhauser, is the Alice Pratt Brown Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she installed the new galleries of American paintings and sculpture that opened in 2012, and where she has curated exhibitions on Thomas Hart Benton, George Calum Bingham, and John Singer Sargent. She currently is co-organizing with the National Gallery in London a major exhibition entitled Thomas Cole's Journey, Atlantic Crossings, that will open at the Met in January 2018. She serves on the advisory board of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill. Dr. Kornhauser has a PhD from Boston University and an MA from Cooperstown Graduate Program in American Folk Art and Culture. Smith alumni in the audience will be interested to learn that she began her career at the Smith College Art Museum. From 1983 to, yes, we always have Smith alumni here, so I wanted to make a plug for that. From 1983 to 2010, she moved to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, where her career ascended through various promotions from associate curator to curator of American paintings and sculpture to chief curator and Keble curator to deputy director and acting director before moving to her current position at the Met in 2010. I'm sure you do. We had the pleasure of working with her, partnering with her on a Haslam show that you may remember that Susan Larkin curated here at the Historical Society, and Dr. Kornhauser did a show at the Wadsworth of their American Impressionist paintings. Suffice it to say that in addition to many significant exhibitions and catalogs, she greatly enhanced the collections with major purchases and gifts of American art, and she has been the recipient of numerous grants and awards. Her topic today is how the powerful landscape interpretations of the Hudson River School of Art shaped American national and cultural identity and demonstrated an awareness of the value of preserving natural sites for future generations, an appropriate topic for our kickoff lecture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kornhauser.
Thank you. I'm all set, yeah. Well, thank you, Deborah. That was such a wonderful introduction. You know, I am very much rooted in Connecticut and have had wonderful experiences with the Greenwich Historical Society, including just a few years ago bringing our Bryant Fellows here for a wonderful tour. As you heard, I'm immersed in a fascinating project with Tim Berenger, who is the Paul Mellon Professor of Art History at Yale, and we are attempting to re-examine and slightly rewrite the history of the Hudson River School with some British colleagues. And so I'll touch on a few of those themes as you know, during the course of my talk tonight. This is a big topic to cover, and I have had the pleasure of working in two museums, the Wadsworth Athenaeum and the Metropolitan Museum, that hold extraordinary collections of 19th century landscape art. So you'll see many of those images tonight. The rise of a national school of landscape painters in New York in the early 19th century has proven to be one of the most important cultural developments in the United States. Early on in the 18th century, portraiture really reigned as almost the only genre, but you would occasionally find, for example, in this very early John Smibert portrait of Frances Brinley of Boston, the occasional local landscape. It was very rare, but here you see a view of Boston in the distance, and this is dated 1729. Later on, the artist Ralph Earl managed to, in his portraits of new citizens of the young republic, here we see Daniel Boardman of New Melford, Connecticut, with a very elaborate landscape in the background. That's a detail of the center of New Melford. So you would see, you know, the occasional landscape, but mainly after the Revolution, our leading artists, John Trumbull and John Vanderlyn, would capture the heroic events of the Revolution in history paintings, and that was considered the highest genre of the time. Here we have Trumbull's famous Battle of Bunker Hill, and later on, John Vanderlyn setting this great scene drawn from an event during the Revolutionary War in the American wilderness, the death of Jane McCrae. But you know, in the early 19th century, it was the American landscape itself that would grip artists, poets, travelers, and artists for nearly a century. From the 1820s through the Civil War era, American painters expressed their art, in their art, a profound sense of national identity by depicting the scale, freshness, and splendor of the New World. Thomas Cole was the first painter in America to grasp the importance of landscape, which came to really become a symbol of the new nation in his mind and the minds of many others at the time. And he would explore the American landscape in great depth, in different formats, creating and exploring different themes. Cole expressed the concerns of his own age through the vehicle of nature, exploring God's presence in nature, moral themes in his paintings. And he would also take on the subject of pure wilderness, which was a very novel theme at the time. He didn't really just spring on the scene in 1825, as you often read in histories of American art. There was a growing interest in landscape culture in the United States in the late 18th, early 19th century, in the form of prints, travel guides, travel literature, treatises on the aesthetics of the sublime and beautiful, and the beginning of the rapid evolution of tourism in the United States. Prospective travelers in the New World could educate themselves about the landscape by reading very prominent treatises, mainly written by English writers at the time. As the 19th century progressed, the novels, poems, and writings of major American authors would also fuel this interest. James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, and William Cullen Bryant were all based in New York City, along with the painters of the time. And this was really the coming together of, not so much of a school, but this kind of loosely formed group of like-minded writers, poets, and painters who came to see the landscape as the appropriate focus. There was also an influx of British artists into the United States in the early 19th century. On the screen is a painting I recently acquired for the Met by the British trained artist Joshua Shaw, who arrived in Philadelphia in 1818 and painted the stormy landscape here, kind of showing all of the traditions of British landscape art. And we know that Cole saw this as a young artist in 1818 when he was in Philadelphia, and it was on view at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Travelers in the New World found Niagara Falls a must-see, great natural wonder. It was considered the greatest natural wonder in the United States, and we proclaimed it the greatest in the world. And many Americans traveled all the way up to view the scene, and it became an absolutely essential subject for any landscape painter to take on. And here we see a kind of early work by the artist Alvin Fisher, who starts painting American landscapes before the Hudson River School really takes hold. He employs a kind of timid way of dealing with the grandeur of the falls. He kind of distances you from it. And to make sure that you understand the sublime aspects, he has this genre scene of this man who's fallen over the side being pulled up. And we'll find far more sublime examples later on of more sophisticated works, but it's really quite charming. Thomas Cole was the preeminent artist of this time, of the founding generation of painters. One of the things Tim and I will be exploring is the fact that he was born in Bolton, England, in the northern part of England, in a highly industrialized landscape. He was one of 8 children of an English woolen manufacturer. As a boy, he experienced the impact of the Industrial Revolution through his father's failure as a small-time manufacturer. And he himself, as a young boy, worked in a calico factory. So we're kind of digging in to explore this in greater detail. And if any of you have not visited the Cole homestead, they are about to open the newly restored second studio of Thomas Cole right on the river in Catskill, New York. And they have made some fascinating discoveries recently in that house, so it's well worth a visit. Cole, as a young boy, encountered the poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge, and later articulated his ideas about art and nature in his own critical writings and poems. He was a very talented writer. I like his poetry. Not everybody does, but I do. He reached America in 1818 at the age of 17, where he pursued an artistic career. And, he, at this point, was virtually unknown. He received a small amount of money to go up the Hudson River. He was already, having had that background, this is a point Tim and I are making, of experiences the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. When he saw the endless wilderness lands in the United States, he could see them as a symbol of the power of this new nation and something that should be revered and taken care of. And it becomes the subject of his earliest art. So he goes up the Hudson River in 1825, does sketches, goes to the Catskills where he encounters this extraordinary phenomenon of Catskill Falls, and paints several paintings over the next several years. This particular work, I think, is one of his greatest early paintings, where he captures the grandeur of the falls, where it features the twin-tiered cascades. You can see this upper tier, and then the water coming down here, and then falling below. It's 260 feet of falling water. He portrays it using all of the elements of the romantic sublime. Storms sweep across the sky, and natural forms of rocks and gnarled branches and dead trees assume anthropomorphic forms here. He emphasizes the bright colors of the fall season, which was very atypical of the British landscape. And he includes the sole figure of a Native American. Here's a detail on the ledge with a rainbow in the scene. I think what he was attempting to do is to show the landscape before white settlement, to show what it looked like, perhaps through the eyes of the Native American who had long ago been pushed off the land. And it's interesting to note that by 1826, when he painted this, there was a hotel, a concession stand, and you actually sometimes had to pay to have the water come down. So it's hard to imagine. But there is no sign of that in this great early work. Cole would be, through the success of these early works, he was introduced through the senior artist John Trumbull, who was by that time in New York City, to some of the great patrons. There weren't many, but there were some highly educated, sophisticated patrons in the United States at this time. And one of the leading ones was Daniel Wadsworth in Hartford, Connecticut, who would become his most important early patron. And Cole visited his great country estate, Montevideo, built on a mountaintop outside of Hartford on Avon Mountain, where he's really living in harmony with the wilderness. Cole has bifurcated the landscape with a wilderness on the left, a slightly cultivated area around the home. He dispenses with some of the traditional landscape traditions of framing devices and kind of shows you this panoramic sweep with the Farmington Valley below. And so, but in addition to the panoramic sweep, this is a detail of the neo-Gothic house that Wadsworth built. And here he is with his wife, Faith Trumbull. He's related through marriage to John Trumbull, strolling along. So telescopic, panoramic, these were kind of radical new ideas for landscape that Cole would explore during these years. He also was aware of the rapid transformation of the landscape. And in his paintings, he sort of walked the viewer progressively through what was happening to the landscape in the early 19th century. Here is another great painting called View in the White Mountains of 1827 that he painted for Wadsworth. But here, rather than the Native American, he has the settler with an axe over his shoulder. And he includes these sort of rough depictions, of tree stumps and the sort of beginnings of the alteration of the wilderness, which he really had mixed feelings about. He also employed contemporary literature for many of his works. He was really attempting to elevate landscape art to the realm of history painting. And so James Fenimore Cooper had just published his great Last of the Mohegans, a really popular novel at the time. And Cole would paint several depictions of scenes from that novel. And this is my favorite. It was painted for Daniel Wadsworth for his private collection. And it shows a scene, this is a detail, when Cora and her sister have been captured by this evil warrior Magua. And the wise Indian chief Tamanund, she's pleading for probably more for their virtue than for their life. And what Cole does in this landscape, he includes these beautiful geological forms. But if you've ever read The Last of the Mohicans, it is highly sexually charged novel. And this scene in particular, with the deep cave and the phallic pinnacle, are straight out of James Fenimore Cooper. So I encourage you to revisit it if you haven't read it in a while. So a brilliant painting. One of the things we're doing in our show is to really study what happens when he makes the decision to return to England in 1829. Cole visits and gets to know James Turner. He sees this painting, Snowstorm, Hannibal Crossing the Alps. He sees, he's not sure what to make of it because it's kind of radical for him. He meets Constable. He learns about oil studies and the artistic process of en plein air landscape painting. He then goes to Italy and spends 2 years in Rome and Florence. So I'm not going to tell you any more because I want you to come and see the show. But it will sort of transform our understanding of Cole's progression. He would return to the United States and receive this major commission from Lumen Reid, a New York merchant, his great 5-part series where everything he learned on this journey is played out in The Course of Empire, where you see him chronicling the rise and fall of a great civilization. You can read it as the Old World, Rome. You can read it as England, his native country, or you can read it as his warning to the United States that unless we pay attention to what we're doing, we could end up in this same scenario. So he begins with the savage state. He takes you through a pastoral Arcadia. This is savage state, pastoral Arcadia. Consummation, which is when things start going wrong. And then we move on to desolation and destruction. And you'll notice there's a mountain with a rocking stone on the top in each one, but it takes a different position. So he starts with the savage state where nature is very prominent. Move on to the pastoral where his time in Italy comes to play with the ruins, but you see nature prominent. Consummation is not a good moment where everything becomes overblown and nature is nearly gone and we've lost sight of it. So these were, this was a powerful moral story that he was telling to US citizens at this time. But right in the middle of working on this, and believe it or not, he was painting this in his studio in Catskill, New York, he just hit a brick wall. He couldn't go any further. So his patron, Lumen Reid, very kindly said, try, work on something else. Take a break. So he produces this great masterpiece. This is the oil study for it. Let me start with this great masterpiece, which will be the centerpiece of our show, the Oxbow. I was able to buy the oil study, which has all of the elements and ideas that play out in the finished work, including this little red spot becomes his self-portrait. But you can see this bifurcated landscape, wilderness, settled lands. It was painted over a version of consummation, which is interesting psychologically, which we will explore. But it is this great masterpiece where he takes all of the lessons of his journey to the old world and creates something that really we see as a statement about the American sublime. So you see the Oxbow set here. So the storm, Turner-esque storm passing across. This exploded wilderness area here. And then he places himself in this self-portrait dead center, wearing a red scarf. He's turned it away from his oil study to confront you, the viewer, basically to say this is an important work of art about ideas. And you notice the brush is pointed to his head. So it's a fascinating masterpiece, which we will play out and explore in our exhibition in great detail. He would then go on to finish the great 5-part series with Destruction and finally Desolation, where you begin to see the landscape coming back again. Landscape, nature was always more powerful than anything man could make or produce. And he would unfortunately die an untimely death in 1848. It kind of really upset the art world. But what we'll do in our show, and what is very much a large part of the story of the rise of the Hudson River School, is that during his final years, he mentored 2 major artists. Here we have Asher B. Durand, an artist who had started as an engraver. Cole, he was very influenced by Cole. And at the time of, a year after Cole's death, paints this famous memorial to Cole called Kindred Spirits, where he places, here is Cole, the painter, with his great dear friend, the nature poet William Cullen Bryant, on his right. And Cole is explaining wilderness. And Durand conflates all of Cole's favorite sites in the Catskills, the Clove, Catterskill Falls, and then this bird flying off. Durand would go on to have an extraordinary career, painting, such great masterpieces as In the Woods, which is basically the forest, the wilderness as our cathedrals. We didn't have ancient cathedrals, but we did have this extraordinary landscape. The other artist and most famous student of Thomas Cole's is Frederick Church, who spent 2 years in Cole's studio from 1844 to 1846, and really absorbing so much from Cole's, Cole's love of nature. He taught Church how to study nature, but I think he also imparted to Church the lessons he had learned on this voyage back to the old world, doing en plein air oil studies, doing studio oil studies. So Church would emerge as the leading figure, the most famous American artist at mid-century. He painted this beautiful memorial to Cole early on in 1849, an extraordinary view above the clouds in the Catskills. Again, you see the bird flying off. And he started out really absorbing the lessons that Cole had taught about elevating landscape art to the realm of history painting. So this very early work, he was still, barely out of Cole's studio, shows the Hookering Party journeying through the wilderness to found Hartford. And Church's ancestors were in that party of people. But it's like the Holy Family, and they're traveling through the wilderness unimpeded. He puts the charter oak tree right here, and all these anthropomorphic. And there is an anthropomorphic profile of a face. That's the eye socket mouth. That was very much coming out of Cole. But Church moves in a completely new direction by mid-century. Church was, native-born American artist, very interested in science and exploration, and was very influenced by the writings of the German or Prussian naturalist Baron von Humboldt, who published his Cosmos, which Church read avidly. And Church would travel to Niagara Falls and create this great masterpiece that is now at the National Gallery in Washington. It's the Corcoran's great painting. The National Gallery now has that collection, where he breaks all of the rules. When he traveled to Niagara, he undertook probably almost 100 graphite drawings and oil studies of the site, trying to figure out how he was going to recreate the actual experience of standing on the edge of the falls, this feeling that you could fall over at any moment. And so in this great masterpiece, he eliminates the foreground, you, the viewer, just standing on the precipice, and no framing devices, and this beautiful rainbow, which is almost always there at Niagara Falls. He didn't make that up. Here it is. And just the power of water coursing over was really seen at the time as a symbol of the power of the United States as we were moving westward to lay claim to our lands, an emerging power. This painting would be shown in New York, and it traveled to London. Church would gain an incredible international audience very early on. He was also influenced, as I said, by Baron von Humboldt, who had made early trips at the end of the 18th, early 19th century to South America. And he encouraged landscape artists to travel to South America and to explore that region as the perfect wilderness setting. Sorry, this comes just before, or just actually before the Civil War launches, and he's still exploring the Northeast, but this is really a statement about the impending Civil War. So Church takes on the role of being a national spokesperson, but he also paints his greatest South American scene, the Heart of the Andes, after 2 trips that he makes to South America in the 1850s. This is considered his greatest masterpiece. It hangs at the Met. It really almost the artist's tribute to Baron von Humboldt, to all of the scientific beliefs that are revealed in Humboldt's writings. And he shows you, this is a beautiful birch tree where he signs his name. It's inscribed into the tree. Then this sort of pilgrimage site with a cross. He shows you the tropical all the way up to the 3 zones up to the snow-capped mountain in the background. This painting is important because it was the first great painting, as it was called at the time, that Church had produced, and he decided to show it as a one-off showing. So he had an elaborate frame made for it. I'll show you that in a minute. And he showed it as a single presentation, and audiences had to come and pay 25 cents to see it. And evidently, it's first showing in New York. He had gas light and curtains and tropical plants, and he encouraged his audiences to use opera glasses. Because what's amazing about this painting is that it's this massive sort of overview of nature, but then the detail is beyond extraordinary. And it was almost overwhelming for audiences to view it at the time. And evidently, in New York, it attracted 12,000 viewers in 3 weeks. And then it went on an national, then international tour to London, to major US cities. And his plan was to send it to Berlin for Humboldt to see, but unfortunately the great scientist died before that could happen. But this painting would become his most famous work and would be used in different ways, as we'll see, over the course of the 19th century. He also traveled to the island of Jamaica in 1865 with his wife. They had suffered the death of 2 children, and they were also, it was the Civil War era, they needed spiritual renewal. So they went to the island of Jamaica in 1865, and Church produced his most extraordinary oil studies at this time. These are just 2 examples of over 100 that he did on the island that summer. It unfortunately was just weeks before the worst insurrection in the island's history would take place. And so interestingly, this was a painting that he painted for his great patron, Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt in Hartford. And you can see the influence of the Turner. Turner was a huge influence on the Hudson River School painters, but this extraordinary swirling storm with the sun attempting to break through over this interior view, the Valley of St. Thomas. And this also, like Heart of the Andes, is filled with birds and flowers and exotic detail, which he captures in these oil studies. And he started to design his own frames at this time. This is a Church-designed frame, interestingly. And you can see Elizabeth Colt's private picture gallery in Hartford, where it was featured. Church helped her to put this entire gallery together. And part of the inspiration was, this is an interesting role that the Hudson River School painters played during the Civil War. They were very involved in the New York Sanitary Fair, which was an effort to raise money for the Union Army. And Elizabeth Colt had a table. She was running the Colt arms manufactory at this time. And she brought tea cakes and revolvers and evidently sold out, according to the New York Times, everything that she brought. And I remember at the Wadsworth, they had her recipe for tea cakes. And here you can see what happens at the fair. Church and the other leading artists of the time organized this fair. They lent their paintings, and they used their paintings to help fuel patriotism. So Church's Heart of the Andes hung here with the 3 US presidents' portraits hanging over it. The great Emanuel Leutze, Washington crossing the Delaware, hung in the center. And then Albert Bierstadt's Rocky Mountain Landers Peak hung to the left. And if you go to our main galleries at the Met, we've recreated this configuration. But the message could not be lost. You know, Washington fought to gain freedom. The nation cannot split apart. And you had views of the southern realm and the western or northern realm of the United States. It needed to be unified. Here's another view. So artists were allowing their paintings to play this patriotic role, which is fascinating. And this was the window-like frame that Church had built. He wanted it to look like a window into the tropical world. This is a period photo by Mathew Brady. And then across the way, his great competitor, Albert Bierstadt, who fought for patrons and became known as the artist of the West, really launched his career. And he, like Church, was an artist explorer. He went out on government-sponsored expeditions. This painting resulted from an important trip he made out to Fort Laramie, where he studied, Native American life. And then he shows you this beautiful scene of the Rocky Mountains. But one of the things that Bierstadt did on occasion in his landscapes, because he did go, unlike Church, decided to seek training in Europe. He went to Dusseldorf, which by the 1850s was a great training ground for American artists. And he wanted to make the West very enticing for his Eastern viewers. And so he stuck this large snow-capped mountain, which really is the Swiss Alps. And this is, and he actually did get in trouble because the photographers started coming back from the American West with accurate views. But he just couldn't help himself. He wanted it to be the grandest and the best. But this was an amazing painting, and here it hangs in the Sanitary Fair as well. And the Met is so lucky that all 3 came to our museum early on. But after the Civil War, there's a definite shift away from these great pictures that we've been looking at, the grandiose, highly detailed, very dramatic paintings that had a kind of national overtone or message attached to them. The artists who established their careers, and there were at least 2 additional generations of Hudson River School artists who established their careers after mid-century, began to return to more familiar scenery. They traveled in great numbers to Europe. They would go to Paris, Munich, Dusseldorf. They became more cosmopolitan in their tastes. And they actually began seeking inspiration in Europe at the same time as American patrons were beginning to buy European art. And, you know, some of this was due to the aftermath of the war, which was one of the worst conflicts in the young nation's history. It no longer seemed appropriate to embrace this philosophy of manifest destiny anymore, that we were God's chosen people, destined, you know, which Bierstadt and Church's paintings really celebrate, that we were destined to take over the lands and reach California by the end of the century, which we actually did. But after the war, there was a need for something different, something to soothe the nation. And so it's interesting that in the 1870s, when this second generation, and we'll see works by Martin Johnson Heade, Sanford Gifford and John Kensett in a minute. It was at this very moment that the term Hudson River School was first applied to this group of artists. And it was applied in a very derogatory manner by a critic in the New York Times. I think it was in 1871, where the style did fall out of favor. It had been hugely popular for so long, but these grand paintings celebrating our conquest of the Western lands just didn't seem appropriate anymore. And the highly detailed style was going out of favor as our younger generation was experiencing the Barbizon school in France, for example. So we see this next generation. Here on the screen is Martin Johnson Head's The Coming Storm of 1859, where it's the most subtle and extraordinary painting, where he just captures this moment just before the storm hits. You can see little flashes of lightning and that heavy atmosphere. He would go on to devote his career to painting the marshes from the New Jersey shore through Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And he became fascinated. He produced over 100 of these landscapes investigating the haystack seen along these coastal marshes. In this works, he explored the evanescent effects of light and weather. These were very, very subtle. He would paint the same view from a different time of day, a different season, this very intense, almost poetic study of a very familiar scene, but in this sort of powerful and beautiful way. They're such beautiful paintings. And during this time, the British writer and critic John Ruskin, his writings about art at this time began to influence his second generation. And Ruskin expressed this new response to nature by writing, "It is not in the broad and fierce manifestations of the elemental energies, not in the clash and hail, nor the drift of the whirlwind, that the highest characters of the sublime are developed." And we think of Church's paintings. "God is not in the earthquake nor in the fire, but in the still small voice." And that really did affect this generation. Here we see Sanford Gifford, who was born and raised in Hudson, New York, very influenced by Thomas Cole, but taking a completely opposite, a sort of transcendental, poetic look at this very famous scene that his mentor Cole had painted in 1826 in a very different way. But this is essentially about a void with light. And it's a great masterpiece, but really engages and encourages the viewer to meditate on nature in a very quiet way. He would go on to paint these very subtle views, sunset on the Hudson, and then his colleague John Kensett would follow a similar trend. Coast scene Beverly Shore, where it's essentially a strip of land, ocean, and sky, in this very large and beautiful, subtle, poetic painting. And he would spend the last year of his life in 1872 on Contentment Island, right near here, off the Connecticut shore, exploring the Connecticut Sound in these very almost abstract depictions of nature in a very pared down manner. And you'll see one of his great paintings, this one, in the Met's Unfinished show, which opens in a few weeks in New York. And this idea of unfinished, in the artist's mind, it's not unfinished. But in the viewers of the day's mind, they felt, does it need more? But it again, is a great masterpiece of 1872, a very different response to the natural world. And toward the end of the century, and as the Hudson River School, the first generation, falls a bit out of favor, we have artists like George Inness, who is really, again, he's influenced by the French Barbizon style, moving in new directions, redefining what sublime landscape means. He would work from memory and from his imagination, and he would distance himself from the immediate experience of nature, very unlike Colin Church, who studied every detail of nature, producing a breadth of effect, focusing on the more formal qualities of landscape. And here we see the Delaware Water Gap, very peaceful scene, Peace and Plenty of 1865, very tonal in its effects. What he was attempting to do, he strove to awaken an emotion in the viewer. So again, these become very personal. They're not these showpieces that you looked at with an opera glass. These were meditative landscapes. By the end of the century, the American frontier declared itself closed. And the landscape tradition, as we knew it earlier on, really did fall out of favor as the Impressionist style emerges. And you know a great deal about that from the work that is done here in this museum. But I wanted to end with Frederick Church's Olana. I was reminded tonight by one of our visitors, it is the 50th anniversary of the saving of Olana. And I remember as a young student first visiting it. And as you approach the house and you look across the river, you realize he sited it deliberately on this beautiful spot that allows this sweeping view of the Hudson River, but it's directly across from Thomas Cole's home and studio. He never forgot, you know, the importance of that. But what happens in the 1870s is that as Church's style has fallen out of favor, he puts all of his artistic energy into creating this great homestead. It was an architectural masterpiece. The interiors were incredible, filled with these exotic decorative arts inspired by his trip to the Holy Lands in the 1870s. But then he also created a massive landscape around it that he carefully designed, which is very much part of this artistic creation. He would spend days on this porch creating the most beautiful oil studies of this great landscape. So, I really feel he would die in 1900. The Met had a memorial exhibition of his art at that time. I really feel like this landscape school almost overtakes the entire 19th century in a way. And, in the early 20th century, at a time when we were looking to Europe for inspiration and modern styles and abstract works, these paintings were put in the storage areas of most museums. But by mid-20th century, we started to renew our interest. And I feel that there's never been a stronger interest in the Hudson River School. The people who are interested in climate change, in the environment, in the desire to preserve our great landscape that's left, really respond. Not only our public, but also many contemporary artists are responding and finding great inspiration from the works of the Hudson River School. So thank you. I'm happy to take a few questions if you have them.
Thank you. So if anyone has questions, I am going to ask you to use the microphone, even if you don't think you need it. So I will come to you. Hold on one moment.
You said that Cole traveled to England, and when he met Constable, he learned about en plein air painting. And do you mean that his landscapes before then had not been painted outdoors?
Oh, no. They're all studio pieces. Oh, yeah. They're all painted in the studio. But remember that he would spend hours and days studying nature. But in his writings, he always said that he worked from memory. But the fact of the matter is, I was just looking at hundreds of his drawings. He did ink drawings and graphite drawings, but he also did oil studies en plein air. Artists like to mislead you in their writings. So we do know he did that. But he would also do the finished studio oil study, which we saw. That was a studio piece for the Oxbow. But these were always completed. They would take sometimes 2 years to complete. and they would work from their studies and drawings and their memory. Yeah. Yes.
Was Thomas Cole highly unusual in the sense of the sweep of history that he demonstrated? He painted early Western civilization, elegant buildings with columns and highly developed society, and then moved on to the wilds of the wilderness. Was that really quite uncommon? And what does that say to us?
Yeah, no, I think that the timing of his career, number one, had he not experienced the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, I'm not sure he would have seen so clearly the power and potential of the American wilderness. Our native-born artists were so busy, you know, laying claim to the land that they didn't stop to consider the significance. And so, you know, I always wondered, had he not come from England, you know, what might have happened. But I also think that he had one foot in an earlier time and lived through to a new time and imparted his knowledge to Frederick Church, Asher B. Durand, very personally. And so it was this kind of succession. And had he not done the journey back, we're also suggesting, I'm not sure that the Hudson River School would have been as successful as it was.
Do you know who commissioned the 5 works from?
The Course of Empire? Lumen Reid, who was a New York City merchant, who represented a new type of patron. His earlier patrons were patricians, you know, coming from very distinguished families. Lumen Reid was a new kind of patron. He had a self-made man who lived in New York City, and he had a private picture gallery and had an amazing vision to support Cole for such ambitious works. Yeah.
Church after Cole was remarkably popular. He had a huge audience, and I've been wondering, you know, why Church fell out of favor, and was Heed and Sanford Gifford and Inness, were they as popular as Church had been?
No, nor were they as successful. I mean, it was inevitable that Church would fall out of favor because he was so successful for so long. And his style, he took his style to the extreme. And that it just happens in art. Like, you know, he went to the extreme with his style, perfected it to near perfection for what he was attempting to do. But then the Civil War happens and new styles in Europe develop, and there are all kinds of new things happening. And so his style suddenly seems dated. And so what does he do? He spends over a decade creating another work of art, which was Olana. But there wasn't, you know, a shift. If you look at European painting, the Barbizon school, the Impressionists, of course it's going to change. I mean, what I find extraordinary is how long he remained popular and how incredibly successful he was. The others were not that successful, no.
Was he also more financially savvy?
Yes, he was. He, you know, his single showings of 25 cents per, he made a lot of money on those. He really did. Was very smart. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we've got time for one more.
We're very fortunate to have several museums within driving distance of here.
Yes.
Olana, which I don't know how much, it's more of a house than a museum, but across the river there is Cole's Place, and there's a museum in Yonkers, I guess, and your great museum. Could you just comment on where most of this artwork is, or is it scattered among all 4?
Well, you live in a particularly rich area. The Wadsworth Atheneum has one of the greatest historic Hudson River School collections of any museum because Daniel Wadsworth collected it and opened the Wadsworth in 1842 with this art. So that's a great place to go. And the Olana and the Cole Homestead are now doing special exhibitions. So you can see really interesting shows at both sites. The Met has probably perhaps the finest collection of Hudson River School paintings, because it was a New York City-based group, and most of the great masterpieces came to the Met at the turn of the century. So honestly, you're surrounded by the finest collections that I could direct you to. Oh yes, they have great, great holdings. Well, Lumen Reid, who I talked about, his entire collection went there. So they have the Course of Empire and really, really fine collection.
Thank you so much for coming.